which is in the reading first on leadership, city money. City money, if you skip forward to chapter 4, it's got the findings and they're summarized there more generally. And then combine that with, this was the first. This book then was the data analysis in this book was then repeated again in subsequent books and subsequent analyses that we did to try to see if there were changes over time. And time is critical here as a way of capturing the context. The most important example we've seen right now was last summer, not right now, but a year ago, when we had looting in Chicago and in many cities across the country, and lots of physical, racial, explicit conflicts, etc. It paralleled in many ways 1968. It wasn't as big, it wasn't as national, but it was pretty big. We got a lot of national coverage with the media, and it's informing right now the Biden administration and many culture discussions and positions. How important is leadership nationally with Biden, with different congresspersons, with people like Putin versus, and Putin will talk explicitly, I'm a strong leader. Trump talked that way, I'm a strong leader. I like Putin because he's strong. Okay, that image doesn't tell you what their content is. What do you do? And second, how do we know if someone is stronger or weaker than another mayor? Not take one person who's trying to elevate his image into whatever that is, but look at 10,000 mayors. We got 10,000 mayors with data on them in 35 countries, and we've done this. Okay, so here, and the first case where we did this is the city money reading. This is laid out clearly here, and the logic is straightforward. Repeat the same analysis over time and see how the results change. So what's the analysis? What we added in this book went beyond most of the leadership discussion from Dahl and Hunter, where they continue the general discussion of policies in general. Now, Dahl added, of course, issue areas. So he talked about mayoral elections, school board, and urban development, but he didn't talk about, say, budgets. And what does the city budget go to? The city budget can go to all those 3 issue areas. It's total budget. If you begin to break it up into smaller parts, like parks and recreation versus economic development versus public health, public housing, and public hospitals, then you have 3 measures that Peterson distinguishes as his, what do they call? Anybody do agree? Developmental is one. Yeah.
I believe they were developmental, allocational, and redistributed.
Perfect. So redistributed is public health, public hospitals, and the like. So we can, several people have published in the Urban Affairs Review these kinds of measures of the Peterson theory. Peterson leaves it with looser data, I would say. He doesn't have comparative city data, which other people have added. And then to look at how much these things vary by city and or over time, which we are illustrating here. The simple big point is that if we have, I'm going to try to stay here. I'm going to get the board right here. The 3 time periods, and what's the impact of a whole bunch of local factors which we may have discussed. If you want, we could slide the podium to 3 inches. Sure. If you're hitting, or you're losing the board.
A little bit, yes.
Okay, well, don't move that.
Okay.
Try moving the podium just 3 inches. I think that's easier.
I'm also able to actually
Stop. Yeah.
there's a record. Let me check.
No, we can't. But that's a less good image. And
Overall, yes.
okay. So, 3 time periods. Question, Jeff, go ahead.
First of all, I was hoping at some point, we could discuss potentially just distinguishing allocation and development policy. I know that Peterson himself said the line through was two policy like yields, but there were times where it wasn't really sure.
The core idea is that allocational, if you think geographically of neighborhood and ward and political representatives, city council members, some go to one ward versus another ward. Others go in ways that may be 2 wards or 6 wards. Others may be loosely the whole city. But you're right, it's not a conceptually totally watertight distinction. And that's part of my point, that these things are not dichotomies or trichotomies in that case. They're more continua. You can have some redistribution going on, and you can try to make it stronger or weaker if you're the mayor and you've got a budget which is fixed from the past, and it's called, say, Parks and Recreation. So you can make Parks and Recreation be more redistributive if you slant it more toward lower income kinds of folks, for instance, in the programs. So for Laurie Lightfoot is now building more basketball courts on the lakefront, right next to the bicycle paths in high-end north side neighborhoods. Basketball courts are visible in Bronzeville, where this is major as a local amenity. They're not so much so on the north side. So to say we're having a symbolic responsiveness to African American basketball also on the north side says the city is listening to African Americans more than it did in the past. In a sense, that's a showing how, and that's illustrating your point, and I'm agreeing with you in saying one can try to talk about things I've just done, but does everybody who plays basketball have to have a black face? No. Maybe some white guys on the north side and white guys on the south side who do skateboarding. Skateboard, you had a TA who was a skateboarder. And he had great skateboard stories about what goes on in the skateboard, which is in Bronzeville. So they're a mixture of white and black guys in different days, different combinations, etc. So these, for some people, these are highly sensitive and politicized. For others, they're consciously trying to be racially integrated. So your point is good, and it brings out the general point of the course, which is almost nothing is a simple dichotomy or trichotomy. Almost all these things are mixed in different ways. That's why any one of these theories is inevitably partial, or we can say slightly wrong. And so being able to say that is what his student Ken Wong elaborated when he took the course. Paul Peterson and I taught a course together on the draft of City Money and the draft of his book. We had a chapter of each book each week, and we argued. we got further apart as we went on. But there were students in the class who were collaborators. And we did later work which elaborated each. And Ken Wong's books included as one of the best efforts to blend these ideas as I'm doing that. But Peterson made them sharper, clearer. They sounded somewhat dogmatic, and he became more famous with people who wanted a clear, simple exposition. But see, almost none of the ideas are new. The core idea of the 3 texts comes from Richard Musgrave, public choice economist, public economist at Harvard, and was used by Ted Lowy in political science before Paul Peterson. So Paul makes it sharper, clearer, and it connects with the public choice penetration of political science, which was not there at the time of Ted Lowy, for instance. So in that sense, Peterson is trying to sound a little more economic theory at a time when this was new in political science. The big point that I'm making getting to Peterson really is if we put down here, say, unions, the mayor's strength measured with such things as the legal structure, and as well as the informal structure, such as the political party in Chicago. These kinds of things, I'm saying these, about 10 of these we used as independent variables, which are in the city money book, chapter 4. Unions, civic group activities, general, and then of groups representing African Americans, low-income persons as a separate measure, three or four things like that. Okay, the big finding is that these leadership type measures were generally significant in this time period. They were not earlier or later. The leadership, if we take the percentage that basically, I think it's percent below the poverty line. I'll just put poverty, POV. Is that okay? That's fair. Okay. Yeah. This basically is middle class, let's say, and measured simply by income. The more we have non-poor persons included, the more we have a lower budget. We found back here. So this was, so poverty, percent poverty was higher budget over here, and was, I think it was either zero or almost zero in this middle period. This was the period of the riots. And the years thereafter, 68, 69, 70, the years after the riots, when those elected officials who ran on the issues of I'm responsive to the most low-income activists in the city, and they responded to the unions, to the mayor's groups, to the civic activities. That's the big story. The point is, before them, the mayors paid more attention to the citizen characteristics, broadly middle class. But this ended in 1974. And that's the big finding, because when we then repeated this in the 70s, 80s, 90s, what did we find? Anybody want to guess? To 2000 and so forth. We found the same thing as the first and the third period. We never really found a strong local leadership effect. That is mostly what we found were invisible mayors. Question?
So I'm wondering if the effects became more.
If the what?
If the effects became more pronounced, in terms of the, or if it remained the same, I guess maybe it's a better way of phrasing it, during Reagan's presidency, if the national politics affected the indifference, or not, but the consideration of citizen characteristics.
No, that's just slowly. If the last, and just your last bit of the sentence, if what affected, just speak a little more slowly and clearly. Sorry?
Reaganomics.
Reaganomics. Okay, there we go.
Reaganomics, if any, on this phenomenon.
Okay, excellent question. That challenges Peterson. Because why does it challenge Peterson? Who can do redistribution according to Peterson? Cities? No.
The national.
Only the national government, Peterson argues. Only the national government can do redistribution, and cities shouldn't try, because if they do, they'll drive out their taxpayers, their more affluent taxpayers, and they'll get more low-income persons. And for a year or two, that doesn't matter, but if you do this for 20, 30 years, you'll lose your tax base and you won't be able to help the low-income persons. That's a simple argument. So what's his answer? How can we help low-income persons? Federal grants. Federal grants. What happens if Reagan is elected? He said, we're going to cut. Did he actually cut? Very little. Spending still kept going up. But his rhetoric, and Margaret Thatcher's rhetoric was the same. We are cutting fat and next greed and so forth and so forth and so forth. And there was a little, so there were symbolic cuts. There were relabeling of categories. So we had the rise of broader categories, and that was important. General revenue sharing came in, which was a broad categorical. And then instead of having a targeted grant just for chairs for low-income persons, it could be for public health. It could be a broader kind of category. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of grants, and which one U.S. congressman wanted to maybe get through for people who wanted chairs for the disabled or something like that, or corner cuts. So instead of having a law and money just on corner cuts, you could have it for roads and transportation. Things of that sort tended to be broadened by Reagan, but the general point is a good test of, that is, if we take Reagan and then we take, I would say stronger than Reagan was probably Trump and what's going on now with Biden. What we have right now is national debates over these issues. They also came in with the Wall Street Occupy movement when the visible top 1% became a strong political rhetorical category that was attacked or variously supported by Trump, and said, these are the people, I'm proud to be a successful businessman. I mean, he said that in ways that were very different from almost everybody before. But Reagan didn't say that. He wasn't. I mean, Reagan was a poor guy from a small town in Illinois, but he made his money in the movies. He was a great cowboy, etc. He's a great talker, but he didn't have a lot of money. Okay, Trump. Okay, so the story of redistribution from the top is the context. That's the big variable which we're getting at here with time. We can get at it better, more precisely, not just with time, because some cities have a whole lot of poor people, others have almost none. Palo Alto versus Gary, Indiana. So those cross city differences are sometimes a better way to test some of this. But to get the context as well, we can also look at better data that we have over time and how each of these levels may have some degree of impact. Okay, that the big bottom line is that if we then repeat this through the 19, whoops, I left off race. If race is sometimes blacks, sometimes black and Hispanics, if we include in the 1990s, race fell to 0. And then on page 63 of the Urban Innovation book, we introduced the concept of marketization. Marketization of the city is closer to the Peterson idea. And so Peterson and I, in that sense, agree with this, not always as Peterson sort of framed it, but it depends, as your question about Reagan immediately brought that out. It depends on because we have more visible, at least in the ideological debates going on between the levels and types of national leadership in this respect in more recent years. Okay. Marketization is thus opening the door to this section, interpenetrating leadership, as I've discussed. And I'm showing it depends on context. Peterson, 3 categories. You can't redistribute locally. Um, do any cities try? The most famous is New York. New York has had a series of fiscal crises in the 1930s, 1970s. New York basically went bankrupt and was taken over by the national government, was given money, but in turn, the national government officials monitored New York City spending, and they cut back on some of the redistributive activity. But New York has had, as I mentioned last time, a weaker mayor. Chicago has the strong mayor classically, and we do redistributive spending when the city has done that, when it's got money from the federal government grant and the program. So that shows the visibility of the level of funding, which is critical in Chicago. On the other hand, there are other cities that never had it at all, such as in Southern California and so forth. Okay, so these illustrate competition among the cities. And that is a concept which in turn Sossin extends and combines with two. She doesn't cite practically anything in this. This is her main theory and evidence book about these issues. In other books later on, she talks about government and culture much more explicitly. When she taught here, she and I taught a series of workshops together, and I said, you know, really ought to talk about politics and culture. Same thing I said earlier about the old Chicago approach. She gradually introduced it, not even in the second edition of this book, but in other books. And she mostly talks about national governments. The theories which he doesn't necessarily cite are really Adam Smith's market and Marx's theory of conflicts. So she looks at redistribution as a conflict kind of policy, but she combines both, and she doesn't explicitly say one is in conflict with the other. She tries to merge them a little bit. And the big variable she adds is globalization, the so-called global cities. New York, Tokyo, London. As manufacturing declines, older industrial cities lose their power, wealth, and residence to these global cities. Similarly, middle managers lose income and decline in numbers as do highly skilled and highly paid production workers, as they're replaced by higher tech machines and the low-cost workers globally who can do the jobs of production, which computers, global communications, and air transit make possible. The World is Flat was the Thomas Friedman book title that's given by an Indian computer expert and leader in an Indian city doing this. Then in a controversial extension of the decline of manufacturing, she suggested income inequality in world cities rises with the impact of global markets, since the affluent grow more affluent. And these affluent bankers and lawyers spend more money for maid services, chauffeurs, and others at the low end of the income scale, generating more inequality of income. That's her core argument. What strengthens this? Why does it work powerfully? Global markets. It's a pure Adam Smith kind of concept. His term was the extent of the market. He didn't talk about globalization. He dealt with it. You could be in one town, 3 towns, a country, but the extent of the market increases the potential division of labor, the wealth of everyone. And so markets have more impact on increasing wealth. And that's her core idea. At the top. The bottom part, she added with migration internationally. And this is this becomes controversial because I'll push on and basically say redistribution linked with Peterson is a more political variable, which she doesn't talk about. She basically is just talking about markets and the corporate private sector without dealing with governmental policies in this book. So what we've done, and I will. No, I'm going to just show you a little image. Yeah, okay, that's good for it. We got enough space there. I'll give you a little version of this. Model 1, globalization leads to inequalities, the Sossen's theory. Second theory, globalization could lead to inequality, but it can lead to anti-inequality policies, such as unemployment insurance, subsidies to people who are disadvantaged by markets, and then okay, so that's just presenting it in abstract. Model 3, if we broaden a little more and say, how does globalization, that is, anti-inequality processes here are after the inequality is there, and people say, I don't like this inequality, I want to change it. And so the alternative is that globalization can be structured with political parties, and those before inequality arrives, it can be prevented or discouraged by having a government which says we want to do this. And Biden is talking very much in these terms now. We don't just want to end poverty. We want to prevent it. And how can we do that? So we can have either, I'll just call this anti-inequality here. So we have inequality, anti-inequality, and this is the classic right, and this is the classic left in terms of political parties. However, what we can then add with theory 4 is other variables. There are a lot of other variables that may lead to either these or either the policies or the actual level of inequality. And an open question is, how much does government make a difference at all? How much are these things, how much is inequality driven more by migration, by private sector decisions that people make on their own, or investment decisions of the corporate sector, or how much difference does government make? And that's a hard question, but we can look at it with things like this. And so many people in Washington and some cities, like New York especially, talk as if we can change inequality in the city if we in the local government adopt more anti-inequality policies. If we look at the evidence like this, then it's not so clear. It may vary by city, individual cities. Some cities like San Francisco and New York have been extreme in some of their policies. And the case studies of those are useful in documenting strong outliers. On the other hand, do these hold up when we have more variables that we can control? That becomes more tricky and quasi-impossible in a case study. You can go to neighborhoods, you can try ideally to look at the characteristics of a New York or San Francisco and find leadership patterns and more. Yeah.
I'm just curious, when you look at, New York currently, San Francisco, potentially outlier when it comes to leadership, Jordan Peterson does the presence of like both New York and California being like, especially California being like high tax states with like a fair amount of redistributed policies statewide, make an impact on the like on the city outcomes, even with accounting for like leadership patterns.
Yes, no, for sure. In that sense, the state is an intermediary, and in your case, the California is a good, strong one. When the mayor of San Diego became governor of California, he said, Pete Wilson, if all the cities of California, that is, if all the cities of California followed San Diego's example, we wouldn't have a fiscal crisis. And we wouldn't have had Proposition 13. Proposition 13 was a major issue in changing this. It was in 1978. It was highly publicly discussed, but people said at the beginning, that's just the kooks in California. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan was elected. Was that the kooks in the whole US? Or was it Reagan's dynamic leadership? Or, and this is where our data come in are important. If we see that the taxpayers' revolt did not start with Proposition 13 or with Reagan, it started 4 years before Proposition 13. That's a major finding interpenetrating these debates, namely that this happened locally. And citizens were part of the taxpayers' revolt in the election of their city council members across the whole US. They voted against the higher spending of the mayors who'd been in power 4 years before. So the local, and so I give lectures on this from 74 to 78. People threw tomatoes at me. They said, you're crazy, etc. And I said, wait and see. And you can find this kind of pattern. That is, citizens count a lot more, even if than in which we have evidence for here, than they do in the media, which tends to look at conflict and to look at the statements of the mayor and say that the mayor is causing this because the mayor prefers this. But even a quasi-revolutionary mayor like Lori Lightfoot doesn't change a lot of she doesn't have a majority in the city council. And so she negotiates and so forth. But the big budgetary decisions are not changed all that much. I've cited the arts as a big change, doubling, but that's an exception. And yeah.
You have to excuse me, I'm Mexican. Could you summarize in a couple of sentences what Proposition 13 was?
Sure. It cut taxes by half, basically. Property taxes of homeowners, which was, or property owners, which was the strongest source of revenue in the city. The Mexican counterpart is Vicente Fox. So Vicente Fox was he defeated the ruling party, which had ruled leadership, which had ruled Mexican politics for most of the 20th century, and he sought to bring in some of these kinds of productivity, lower cost, more efficient, more responsive to citizen policies. He got attacked later on, et cetera. But the politics, you find very similar issues going on in Mexico. Is just what I'm saying. And in other countries around the world. How about cross-national comparisons, such as you start there? Bob Lucas, Nobel laureate economist here, took this a step further than Sasson. And he said, Sasson's wrong. Globalization does not increase inequality. Lucas said, it decreases inequality. Why? Because of markets, but which markets? Who's in which market and why did he posit the opposite? He looked at data over time. Sasson-Darilli did not. And he looks at he asks the question, why do those people from Mexico leave Mexico and become taxi drivers or pastry chefs or whatever in New York or nannies, etc. The simple answer is, and I'll ask for Mexico and then for the Philippines, two countries which are among the largest. They were, I think, they're still the largest immigration countries into the U.S. Mexico and the Philippines. What's the largest sector of the economy within the domestic Mexican or Filipino economy? Export of cheap parts to Detroit, farming, fruit, stuff which is shipped into grocery stores and so forth? No. What's the most, so labor, let's ask about labor. Labor of what kind? Cheap labor working, say, in Mexican factories?
No. They export labor. They export cheap labor.
Okay, there we go. So the Mexicans come to the US, Canada, and they send the money back to their families. That's what you mean. That's the right answer. It's called retribution or remittances. Yeah, remittances is the term. If you remit to your family, and in the case of Mexico, they're Mexican mayors who will come to New York and Chicago and LA and say, the bridge got washed out in your town. I'm talking to you because, 8,000 of you people are from our town. If you will, and even the national Mexican government has said, we will match 50-50. The Mexican national government will match your contributions to fix the bridge. And they get a lot, then they fix bridges by going to the US and talking in Mexican neighborhoods successfully. Plus, the Mexican national government sent teachers to teach Mexican language classes in US schools and pay their salaries. Yeah.
Interesting fact. Second city with most Mexicans in the world is LA.
Right on. Yes.
So I was wondering, really, like, is there like evidence to suggest that no countries that is brain drain, no countries because
Well, low what countries?
it's like, is there brain drain in those countries, those lower income countries that cause maybe skilled people are moving out to these more developed countries where that sending the money back, or
Yes, I mean that's a simple process which is documented. If you add the twist which I'm adding for India, you've got poor, smart, well-trained engineers who come to Silicon Valley, they make $1 billion, then they go back to India, and they, in part because they're proud, in part because they want to help India, in part because of maybe you can make more money there, in part of maybe there's subsidies, who knows, a combination of factors has led a lot of these people to go back and build up the whole Indian computer high-tech economy in ways that make the title of the book, The Market, the World is Flat, suggests that you can have new ideas anywhere. So in that sense, it's the opposite of the brain drain. Or put differently, it's an effort to bring back, and some of the evidence suggests that top programmers can earn roughly the same if they're working in the Bay Area or in India. So in that sense, it clearly, you got many different kinds of programmers and other people, but the point is the big disparity has gotten smaller, not in all of India. There's still massive poverty in India, but in certain selected, and in that sense, this is the Adam Smith globalization market at work. We had a hand or two up.
Yes,
I was just wondering, would it be an after being an assassin to suggest that like her he was more a United States impacting globalization? Because there was discussion about like manufacturing cities having the economic bottoming out, even as like global cities like New York and LA saw as like emergence.
Definitely, yes. Her data show that it works best in New York, much weaker in London and Tokyo. There's a paper called Why Sasson is Wrong by a leading economic planner in London. And he says the basic problem with Sasson is that she leaves out all the redistributive, inequality government policies, which are much more generous in England. And then others have looked at this internationally and find it more true in France or in other continental countries than in England. But if it's true in England, but England still has more than the US, and England has had, with the drastic decline of manufacturing everywhere in the world, England has had many more people who stay on unemployment insurance for a couple of decades than does the US, where it's more limited, tighter, and it's also highly politicized. So Tony Blair, when he broke with that traditional left pattern, said, we're going to separate the unions from the party. We're going to call it New Labor instead of Labor, because I don't want to support those programs. So in that sense, he was closer to Thatcher in the economic narrow aspect of trying to adapt. Macron is doing the same kind of thing. Macron and Tony Blair were very liberal on many social issues, race, immigration, and so forth. But they were seeking fiscally. I mean, I don't want to simplify because we get immigration with Muslim politics and so forth. But basically, the social issues were distinct from the fiscal issues for these folks. Okay, good questions you're raising. You're raising good core questions for this area. Let's see here. We can go into any of these in more detail, but do you want to raise any broader questions? I mean, you've been raising them, but you want to raise them with any specifics now, such as how this shifts in India. If we have any Indian, we're going to get more Indian examples, but if you have any comments you want to add, fine, please do. But let's have a little more open discussion, and if we don't, and I can bring in more detail if you like.
I just have a follow-up question. As you know, talking about Silicon Valley, so in India also like the people have come back and Professor was saying they have a Silicon Valley movement, that's Bangalore, that's Hyderabad, that's developing. And when we talk about like salary for the programmers and disparity, so a lot of work has been moved to India. Now that they'll be seeing like a lot of technology work being done in India. So that's how like it's effect of the globalization, that people are coming here, they are studying, they are going back, and they are kind of building a city, building economics back in their country. So brain drain doesn't really work over there. It's just like working with like instead of a lot of people going out, it's like one or two people going out and establishing that kind of culture back in their own country. So it depends on like how you want to see it.
Are you following up on that? Or you got a new question? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, following up on just generally the decentralization market, I think, decentralization of labor market as it relates to teleworking, I think.
Yeah, the relationship to what?
How the decentralization of market can be further exacerbated by teleworking, like
Okay.
that you brought up. I noticed that my job this summer, we had some people who worked in offices in India and other countries, and although they were contributing similarly to the team, their salaries were significantly different, and they had this entire framework for compensation based on the home offices of individuals who work within the local firm. And in that sense, I would think that the globalization and in particular the decentralization of the labor market, in that regard would make inequality worse. And so that would be another argument, counter argument about globalization and inequality.
Okay, now for sure, I mean, there are some industries or sub-industries for sure which fit that story, and that probably is a generally valid story for many kinds of firms. Labor is cheaper usually out, or was clearly 20, 30 years ago outside the US. So, and this is the Silicon Valley of India has counterparts elsewhere. So we have variations within in India, but even within, say, computers, you can have people who are the support staff who answer your telephone calls. How do I get my iPhone to do this? And you now can get, for many, not just Apple, but let's say many other programs, you have many people with Filipino and Indian accents who answer. Okay, probably those people are paid less than the people who don't talk to you on the phone, but are doing the high-level programming, creating the new Apple operating system and stuff like that.
Okay,
So I'm saying probably there's room for both.
right, yeah, I guess, no instances of my personal experience noticing this, it was the same job in different places.
It was what in different places?
The same job.
Same job.
Position, in one office over another office, in India versus in the United States had vastly different compensation. And although there was a global staffing model, they essentially made it so that if you were living in the United States in any of the United States offices, you had a certain level of compensation that was flat, and if you were living in another one of the offices, regardless of where you were staffed and where you were working, where you were traveling for work, your compensation.
Okay. Remember the one-liner critique of the neoclassical economic argument from John Maynard Keynes, which is in the long run, markets work, but in the long run, we're all dead. So they never really make everybody necessarily equal, or they may happen in a longer run than ever really gets implemented. So in that sense, I would say that the question is not to say the theory is right or wrong, but to say, let's try to sharpen these theories by saying where and why does the market explain? And probably the answer with Lucas is that and this is what Lucas says very explicitly, over time, as we have more global competition, that will increase wages in the low-income countries that are doing things productively and that meet global competitive. And so the way that Friedman is took the world as flat puts it, when he said that, people in all the talk shows said, you're ridiculous. How can you say India and China, are going to pay the way we do in Silicon Valley? And he said, I'm talking about the top 5%. Okay, so that was almost an afterthought. It is in the book itself, and then it gets two books on it. So first was the Lexus and the Olive Tree, and then the follow-up was The World Was Flat. So in between, he was debating this kind of stuff. But in a sense, it's not that one is right and one is wrong. Look at the sectors, subsectors, and look at changes over time. And it may be that the incomes of Mexico are going up, not just with short-term sending money home, but that they're paying more in other kinds of jobs. And this is happening in even rural China. Rural China used to have many manual workers doing very low income kinds of things. There's a lot of, go back 30, 40, 50 years, lots of documentation of this. More recent, more journalistic accounts discuss rural China is now having a hard time finding anybody to work in their factories. So what do the rural Chinese companies do? They contract out to Indonesia and Vietnam. But the point is, rural China is following Lucas's markets are leading to higher salaries. And within China, people can then migrate from the rural to, and that this is a classic driver of urban to rural, rural to urban migration. That go to the big, leave the small town, go to the big city, Detroit, and you can earn more money than you can have steel or automobile factory. Okay. Things get more complex. Yes.
I'm not sure if this is oversimplification, but like the entire idea of like trickle down economics of the richest and somewhat of now, like that pull out, you know, those income people. Is that almost blind to the world scale of the richest?
So just one start. Is that what?
In that whole idea of almost trickle down economics.
Trickle down economics.
It's almost applied in the global sense that higher income countries slowly bring out middle income countries to insert I think or that kind of what
Yes, exactly. And this is a classic argument and this classic critique of Keynes that in the long run we're all dead, even if it is happening, and that people are getting richer all around the world. You know, okay. So let me add two more quick references here to serious studies that have tried to detail these things. One was a PhD in the Netherlands by Jeroen van der Wallen. Jeroen van der Wallen. And he did a careful critique of all the globalization literature, especially Sasson, and basically said she's sloppy, messy, unsystematic. Her data are not really set up to analyze or test her own theories in any coherent way. She doesn't have multi-causal analysis like this. She has what's called crosstabs, you know, A versus B, or A, how does A relate to B? And if A increased, if A is positively related to B, you can see that in a table. That doesn't say, how about C or D or E? And so if you try to include these, as he then did, he found that he found the same thing that was shown in another. Okay, well, let me say this with us. He found that the first half of the book is on producer services, because this is also an original argument of Sasson. That is, why do you have income inequality and economic growth? Her answer in globalization should lead to more inequality in those firms that are doing what are producer services? Anybody? Law, accounting, banking, those things that don't work for or sell their products to you and me, they sell their products to other big companies, like an advertising company. An advertising company makes ads and they sell them to people who sell cigarettes or cars or clothes. There are a lot of them around Wall Street that deal with, let's say, if you want to say, if I want to start producing a battery-driven car, what are the problems I would have in selling it in South Africa, Argentina, and Czechoslovakia? Okay, there are law firms in Wall Street that specialize in that kind of question. So I'll have 300 lawyers, and I'll have people in those different countries who know those countries, and they'll say, we'll tell you in 2 days. So instead of having to try to do it yourself, so the producer service firms also are quintessentially global in that example, and they're also they vary a lot by city. Chicago doesn't have as big a financial sector as Wall Street, but Chicago has in many areas lots of producer services. Accenture was one of the most important. It's part of Arthur Andersen that broke that up. But Accenture and there's several people in the Harris School who come from Accenture who know a lot about fancy mathematical modeling of decision making, but who don't come from traditional, that is, who then have shifted as well to politics. So they're using their mathematical models, and and Obama from Chicago some of the time knew about these folks, and he brought in several that advised him in the Obama administration. Now some of those people are at the Harris School. So we have a combination of both economists working on economics, but we also have people with this kind of quantitative trading working on politics in the Harris School in ways that are, and they link with some people here in economics and computer and computer courses and MA series and so forth. Okay, this was illustrated by a woman named Sing Shong. She did an MA here. She worked with me and with Saskia Sassen. I was in a workshop. She was interested in these same issues. And she got, for the first time, really, US, not 3 cities. She got all the data for US cities over a certain size where she could get enough of the data to analyze them comparably. She then added more controls. So she had a bunch of other variables and then said, how much does inequality increase if we have more immigrants, more foreign direct investment, or more producer services? And she found that immigrants and foreign direct investment were related to more inequality. In that sense, support for Sassen. Not so. Zero impact of producer services. The major original idea of Sassen was not supported. We even got Sassen to co-author the paper. So we have a summary of this, briefly summarizing the long MA, but the 3 of us published the paper together, and reluctantly, Sassen doesn't cite it very much, as you can imagine, but other people do. Okay, so, and this illustrates how you in an MA can address major theoretical issues and take on and refute one of your faculty right here, and that's fine. Okay. What's the time that you have?
It's 5:34.
Okay. What did van der Walle find? Okay, so Sean found other things matter, and she had, and she worked as a research assistant with me and then with Jim Heckman in economics, Nobel Prize winner, major force behind the Harris School's focus on these economic kinds of models, and whose wife was also a research assistant of mine, and worked on this stuff that I'm reporting now with City Money. He has a lot of sociology books all over his walls, and he reads his stuff. He reads his sociology journals that his wife used to get, and then tries to look at things that include a variety of these processes. And he's done this more as, since he's gotten the Nobel Prize, he was on a very kind of technical issue of sample selection bias, and how can you measure and systematize that? And he did that brilliantly, a lot of stuff, but he's now working on much broader kinds of things, many fewer math models, easy to read stuff, and he brings in psychology, sociology, political science, and economics, and talks in a way that sounds more like Gary Becker, and he's replaced Gary Becker as the most cited economist, I think, in the world, or he was a couple of years ago. The point of these is to look at the interpenetration, not just of the disciplines, and say, economists study money. Gary Becker didn't study money at all. Our book City Money won a prize for the most outstanding book in the world at that time in business management and economics. And we beat several economists in their economic, but, you know, Lauren and I weren't economists. And in that sense, it deals with money in a classic economic kind of way, but brings in the culture and the politics and the context in a more systematic way than economic work had done previously. In each of the chapters, we illustrate this. So my simple point is, the economists are now studying everything we do in most of the social sciences, and some things they do more carefully, others the anthropologists do more carefully. They get one case or individuals who illustrate it, they'll have quotations, they'll use language, they'll use close observation, and each of these can add subtlety and insight and complement each other. When we're at conferences together with people from these different backgrounds, for instance, talking about schools, how can you build schools or improve schools, or how can you make charter schools work better? You can have Steve Raudenbush, who's in statistics and sociology, Jim Heckman, William Julius Wilson, who was here, and we had a conference with and other people from Harvard, different kinds of methods, and then everybody talks in a way where we learn from each other and use many different kinds of models and evidence to try to see, do these ideas work and are transferable or not? Because the charter schools are so successful in some areas, including Steve Raudenbush. I mean, the University of Chicago has several charter schools, which Raudenbush has built the curriculum for. And they have something like a 98% of the high school kids go to college. That ain't true of the Chicago public schools. So what do they do in those charter schools? One of the superintendent of schools in Chicago a few years ago was the son of a professor of education here. He grew up in Hyde Park. He also played basketball with guys with darker faces. And so he loved basketball. He was concerned about redistribution kinds of issues. And he started working in the schools as a teacher, and then became superintendent of schools. And he was, this is under Obama. He was the Secretary of Education. One thing he did in Chicago was related to these kinds of ideas about markets. How can you make charter schools and public schools more competitive and with the world? The Chicago area is another place to look, and I'll join these two together. They have math contests around the whole world. They look at math scores. They test people in their quality of math and of physics and certain other kinds of things in high schools in France, in China, in India, in the US. The US is terrible. And one of the worst cities in the US is Chicago. The Chicago public schools have got disastrously low test scores and success rates on these kinds of measures. At the same time, you have Naperville, Illinois, was #1 in the world in math and #3 in physics in the metro area. So mayors nearby can either be the best or the worst in the world. Huge local variation in different individual schools. It's a book on this by a psychologist at Harvard. And I won't do it. Well, just one quick example. If the kids in Naperville run for 20 minutes, then they come to the math class right afterward, and they're energized, and they say, "Oh yeah, hey, I'll solve that equation." And they're #1 in the world. They beat the Indians because of running. Okay, at least that's the psychologist's argument, and the high school. So that is, they combine these kinds. Plus, they have. I mean, I had a student sat right there a year or so ago, and she said, I said, where are each of you from? She said, well, I'm from the Chicago suburb. And both of her parents were PhDs in physics. Okay. Around Naperville, you got people like that working at the Argonne National Laboratory and others, the National Accelerator Laboratory. There are a lot of people who are not,
Yeah.
who are running, but also have parents who show them how to run faster. Yeah.
There are a lot of people like immigrants in Nepal. I know like there's a huge Indian community over there. There are people that might be also one of the factors.
In terms of brain drain, let me ask, which ethnic group in the United States has the highest income? You just take the whole ethnic group, including Jews, Mexicans, Indians, Russians, and so forth. Yes.
I believe the Asians, no?
Which Asians?
East Asians,
Which East Asians?
Chinese, or South Koreans, man?
No. Wrong.
Japanese.
No. Indians. The Asian Indians living in the U.S., people of Asian Indian background, are earn more on average than the Jews. Jews used to be very high, Russian Jews, especially more, recent years. But the Asian, so on the other hand, there are a whole lot of people in India. Does this mean that all the brains have been drained to the U.S.? No, there are lots of brains in India, but it also says they got some very good schools, and we're going to hear more about this. We'll look for more evidence. He's from a province called Kerala, which has a very strong educational focus, and we'll bring out more about that when we talk more about it. Did you have any follow-ups?
No.
No. Okay. Good. I was going to add the market idea. How can you have not just cities, but also, or let me add one more point. We talked about Norquist, who was the mayor of Milwaukee and then became the international leader talking about, abolishing freeways. Milwaukee was the only major city in the country to use contracting out in a serious way, and that you could use the money, instead of having your money go in your taxes to the school board as it does in Chicago. That is, if your children go to private school in Chicago, you pay the same taxes as if they go to public school. That is, there's no money subsidizing civic charter schools or private schools in Chicago. In that way, and because the union, there's a book called Union Rule on Chicago National Teachers Association, basically. When city money came out, the NTA invited me to Washington. They have their top leaders who meet privately with nobody from the press, and I was amazed how much they fight against each other. And people from places like Milwaukee, including Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and so forth, were very explicit. We're against you guys in Chicago, New York. We want to work with the parents. We want to work with people who are studying how to make schools better. Most of our members, most of the people who are teachers are there because they want to help kids learn better and do a better job. We in the union in New York, Chicago, we want seniority. We want pay for seniority. We want higher pay. We don't care about what goes on in the classroom. We don't want to have testing. Testing is against us. Is what they would say. Whereas people in the so there's division among educators is my point. Okay, so how was this then resolved in Chicago by one smart superintendent? Got lots of big buildings, and many of them had shrinking numbers of students. He rented out space in those empty rooms in the big public schools to charter schools. And then the kids walking in the same halls, the teachers walking in with the teachers in the same cafeteria potentially or whatever, were both the charter school kids and the Chicago public school kids. So Chicago's a union city, no end of the, no contracting out, no money. That is, if you get a scholarship, but your parents would still pay more if you went to the charter school. Milwaukee's the exception here, but there are ways that you can nudge in a competitive direction without necessarily bringing down so, and I'm citing this because Rahm Emanuel ran for mayor and won twice. The second time he didn't have a plurality at the beginning, they had a second election because he was really beaten down so much and he handled the public schools in a way that were seen as anti-neighborhood, anti-school, and that was the rhetoric which tended to dominate. Whereas, okay, so I won't go into more detail on that, but other yeah, I see. I'm showing my how's our time?
3 minutes, 5:27.
Okay. Any more general questions? But these are good examples of taking the big ideas from the theories, not just Peterson's 3 types, but markets more generally, and saying where and how can you try to bring in market competition, or the opposite, saying we don't want to let any of that work here. As I live in Bronzeville, these are big issues for African Americans for sure. One big one analogous to this was when I was working here with Bill Wilson. We were looking at the general idea that unemployment is higher for African Americans in the US nationally, and that's a classic number for decades. And it's true nationally, but there was an economist who then went to the Ford Foundation, was the head of their economic analysis for a while. And he analyzed this by city. And he found that in Phoenix, LA, cities with low numbers of manufacturing jobs and low percentages of manufacturing jobs did not have a disparity between African American and whites in their unemployment or many of their salaries. That is, African Americans had more jobs, better paid, men and women in those cities. Why? And his answer basically, although he's more of an economist, he didn't want to go into the politics, was basically that the unions create and foster a view that you can't get ahead without the union. Support the union. And if the union loses and they close down the steel mills, all you can do is get unemployment. And we'll try to help you get that. But that's a political, ideological decision, which is now widespread among many of my Bronzeville residents. Strong unions, subsidies, having the government help us is the main way that we can succeed. They don't say that in San Diego, Phoenix, etc., LA, and they have many more entrepreneurial firms that link without using that, and they're non-manufacturing. So in a post-industrial era, when manufacturing goes down, and we have more of these other kinds of services, things like Uber driver. Uber drivers were non-unionized, although now we're getting, it's local politics, and that depends on the city. But these kinds of things of how you define competition and where can competition like Uber or charter schools in the big buildings enter a situation where we have both. Okay, so those are things to think about, not seeing that any one theory is right or wrong, but where and why can we use different theories and what are the contexts that make these work better or not. Thank you.